Hello, and welcome back to season 4 of Venus Rising. I'm your host, Callie Fell. Today, I would like to welcome to the show Jennie. Jennie currently lives in Colorado with her husband and 2-year-old son. She and her husband have been married for 14 years, and 7 of those years were spent facing the heartbreak of infertility until their son was born at the very beginning of the global pandemic in March of 2020. Jennie and her husband went through 3 rounds of IUIs and 1 round of IVF in order to conceive their son. And in hindsight, Jennie now realizes the moral and ethical compromises she made during their fertility journey, which has resulted in 29 frozen embryos. Jennie wishes that she would have had more education on the ethical ways to do IVF before jumping in on the fertility roller coaster. And while she's thankful for her son, her and her husband are now facing the ethical ramifications of having so many frozen embryos. So she's here today with the hopes of encouraging others to research alternatives to fertility treatment and ethical ways of engaging with assisted reproduction prior to being swept up on this fertility roller coaster. Jennie, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with me. I appreciate your willingness to come on air and share such a personal story with our listeners.
You bet. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack over 7 years of treatment. So let's start at the beginning. How did you and your husband make the decision that you were going to start to seek fertility care? What were your first steps like? What were you thinking? How were you emotionally? Let's start there.
Sure. So we decided to start trying for a baby in about 2012. I remember the exact moment where we were like swept up in like this family vacation, my husband and I and his family in Europe, and we were at this like gorgeous castle in Vienna. And we were just like, walking around with my in-laws and just like, this is so beautiful, but, we're missing something. We really felt like we'd been married for 4 years and had that, a lot of alone time. And it just felt like we were missing a baby. And so we decided then to start trying for a baby. And it was about a year, we went through like the normal ups and downs because I had read, I'm a researcher. So I had read like it can take up to a year to, get pregnant when you're trying your first time. And so I didn't really think anything about it until probably a year later. And then in 2013, I just went to my regular gynecologist and just kind of was like, hey, we're trying and nothing's happened. And we did the usual blood work and it didn't show anything concerning. So, despite the fact that all my blood work came back normal, I left that appointment, actually my second gynecologist appointment ever in my life, with a prescription for Clomid. Wow. That was just like, jumped right into it. And we, went through the Clomid. I took the Clomid. I had to go back for an ultrasound to make sure that it worked, and that I did ovulate, and it did work. I just didn't get pregnant at that round. So
did your husband also seek care while you were going, and started Clomid?
Hindsight's always 2020, right?
Of course.
And looking back, being like, wait a second, hold on, this doesn't make sense. But when I talk about, the fertility roller coaster, it really, I say I'm a researcher. I didn't research this at all. I mean, this was just, you get swept up because this is just so personal and so emotional that you're just like, whatever it takes, I'm going to do it. When you get to that point. He had not, at that point, he had not had any kind of evaluation done. Nobody even talked to me. My gynecologist never said, we may want to have him tested before we try Clomid. I don't know why, the assumption was that the problem was with me and that I needed to start with medications, even though all my blood work came back normal. So, that's just one thing looking back that I'm like, one of many that just didn't make sense. So, so after that, we kind of just took our time. We weren't in any place financially to be able to afford fertility treatments. We had so my husband is Romanian, and I met him while I was living in Romania, working in an orphanage. He's not an orphan, by the way. Everybody asked me that, but yeah, we got married there and then moved back. So we had only been in the States for maybe 3 years. So we weren't really financially stable yet. So we weren't in any place to afford fertility treatments or begin that process. So we just kind of took our time. And, because my blood work came back normal, I was just hoping that it would happen, so in 2015, I still hadn't gotten pregnant. And that's when we really decided, okay, we need to look into this a little bit more. And I went back to my gynecologist, had more blood work done. And at this time, I was shown that I had a polycystic ovarian syndrome, which I don't know what happened between then and, 2013 and 2015 when I had originally had my blood work. But it explained a lot of irregularities in my cycle and things like that. So after being diagnosed with PCOS, that's when we were referred to an actual reproductive endocrinologist and went to a fertility clinic near us. And our first appointment with this doctor was awful. He came in and literally everything he said just went over our heads. He didn't really even check in to make sure that we understood what he was saying. It was just, he didn't really seem to care, whether or not we got it. He was just like, and it felt like he was selling us like a one-stop, a one-size-fits-all solution. Like, this is where you're going to do IUIs, and then you're going to do IVF. And then, and we left that appointment. And mind you, this was again, before my husband had any tests done. So we left that appointment with basically the understanding that he was our only hope if we wanted to have a child. Even after my PCOS diagnosis, there was never any kind of counseling on this is what you can do natural, to try to regulate your cycles naturally. Here's some supplements you can take, diet, exercise. There was just none of that. It was just okay, PCOS, here you go. You need a reproductive endocrinologist. So we, after that, then my husband finally did get tested and then showed there were some issues there, which pretty much made us the perfect storm of infertility. So, I talked a little bit earlier about the infertility roller coaster. It really was at this point that we got swept up into it. And if you haven't been through fertility treatments, you might not know what that entails, but it's really you sit down, in the roller coaster ride, and you're like, I'm here to gather information, resources, see what my options are. And it's like those safety bars drop and you take off and you're like, wait a second, I wasn't ready for this, but you're like, what the heck? These guys know what they're talking about. So I'm just going to hold on and enjoy the ride or endure the ride, as best as you can. So our next step was the IUI, intrauterine insemination.
Did you stick with the doctor that you felt like you didn't?
We did.
Kind of your savior doctor, but you didn't really understand him. You stuck with him.
Yeah. And, part of the reason is, if you think about it, from a financial perspective, we had paid, $300 for our initial consultation. Oh, wow. And then we had testing done with them, which to the tune of, $1,000 is all the fertility testing, and none of that was covered by insurance. So, that again is why you feel like you can't get off the roller coasters, because if I got off, you waste all that money, because if you want to start over again, you have to pay all of that over again. Sure. If we wanted to switch clinics, we were going to have to do all of the, consultation fees over again. And who knows if they were we need more testing. So, you just kind of were all right, we're already started, let's just keep going. So we did our IUI with them, and didn't know it at the time, but actually the timing was completely off and we didn't stand a chance of getting pregnant during that IUI. My follicles weren't big enough when they did the procedure. So there was just no way that it was gonna happen. So,
how do you know that now? How do you know that timing was off? What have you learned since then?
Yeah, so we actually ended up switching clinics, and they sent all of our records to this new clinic, and the doctor was like, your follicle was only, I don't remember the size, but with, this size when they did it. And that's when you had your trigger shot, which is what releases the follicle. And he's like, that timing was not right. Gotcha. So that was really hard to find out that we had wasted at that point, I don't know, $2,000 on the IUI or whatever.
Well, not only the waste of money, but you trust these physicians, right? Any physician, doesn't have to be fertility. If your loved one's in the hospital, you trust them to give you accurate information. So that's, I'm sure you felt a little, well, I don't want to put feelings on you, but I can understand how that would also feel like you're betrayed a little bit, but I'll let you get back to your story.
Yeah, no, it definitely did. Like you said, you're supposed to trust these doctors. And that's when you start to think about the conflict of interest here of how these people are making money. It's one thing for a doctor to bill insurance, which, whatever, it is what it is, but to bill the patient directly and then to not do things correctly it's almost more of a blow. So you just realize at that point that, maybe they don't have, I don't want to speak for all doctors, of course. I mean, we've met really great people in our fertility journey, but maybe, the actual patient care is not the main goal here. And I never thought about that before, before watching the, big fertility and then being like, oh, wow, this all makes sense now. People didn't, I don't know, either I wasn't around people who did talk about it back then, or it just wasn't, quite as known as, what was going on. So, anyway, so then we did, after that failed IUI, we decided to switch clinics. And our doctor was great. We really, really liked our doctor. He sat down with us and he drew things out. I still have the drawings, from him of like, this is an egg, and, just like really basic stuff, which, I mean, people don't know. I think you'd be surprised about what people do and don't know about their own fertility. So especially if you've grown up in like the church and, that sex ed is really missing. So I think this was at least my growing up. So it was really informative. And, he was great, but it did feel like, again, it was this one size fits all solution, where there wasn't any like, why don't you try this first? Why don't you, I don't know, like, here's some supplements, like I said, for the PCOS or for the, the sperm issues that my husband was having. Like, it was just really not much of that at all. So
kind of like, here's a protocol. This is what we use, and it's going to cost this much for each step. We're going to do each step. Leave it.
Exactly. So, we did 2 more IUIs with this clinic, just because he was like, I think once you hit 3, your chances diminish significantly of getting pregnant from an IUI. So we did that. And, all the time, I think I'm a little bit removed now from the emotional side of it, just because I have my son. And, I had a really good friends who were going through, or who had gone through infertility before we did. And they're like, once you're holding your baby in your arm, you'll never forget, but some of that pain is like, diminished, or it's not as strong. And I was like, yeah, right. This, you're in the middle of this. I'm never going to forget this, but it's true. Like, it's, but I do remember watching everybody around me getting pregnant, friends, and just, it sucks. It's not the natural order of things. And it's, it's hard. So anybody who's in the middle of it, I get it. And at that point, you're going to do whatever it takes to get pregnant, because that's, that desire's on your heart. So, we did it.
Do you think that, sorry to interrupt, do you think that in your experience that the clinics, and we're not going to single out doctors because there's a lot of players in the clinic, but do you think that did you feel like they capitalized on that vulnerability, that like place of being like, I so badly want a child. I'm seeing my friends and family do this. I am brokenhearted over this. Or did you feel supported?
So,
Like, what was your thought process?
yeah, I don't know. I obviously can't speak for other clinics. My clinic, and there's a reason I'm not mentioning their name because I don't want to drag anybody's name through the mud. They did everything by the books. They were, you know what I mean? It's just, I think, the nature of the industry, but there's this weird disconnect once you step into that clinic from the emotional side of things and the physical side of things. Like, I remember sitting in the waiting room with all these women we're all in the same boat. Like, we could all, be supportive of each other. We could all, but nobody's talking. Nobody's looking at each other in the eyes. Nobody, and my nature is to talk, but I just knew that these women just weren't wanting to engage that way. And I mean, yeah, the clinic, says, here's some resources. We have support groups, blah, blah, blah. But it was never, there wasn't a lot of like, how are you doing? Or, like, it felt sterile. It felt like you're in a doctor's office, that's really what it felt like. So, thankfully I had a wonderful support system with family and friends, and, because if not, it would have felt very, very lonely. So, yeah. So after the failed IUI in 2016, we were just told, like, you have to do IVF. That's your next step. And we had no way of paying for that. I mean, we're talking $35,000, $40,000. We have no way of paying for that. So we just took a break, lived life, again, emotionally, it was hard. We watched family members and friends, start their families and have second kids, have third kids. And you're like, here you are, so, we did what we could. We got dogs because, you need to take care of things. And funny enough, getting both of our dogs corresponded like to when both of my nephews were born. It was like one of them, my nephew was born, the next day we got a dog, it was very, it's like, that's kind of just how you dealt with it. So, and then, I'm thankful for the time that I got to spend, with my nephews without my child, because now I just have no time for anything, but, I got to love on them, and it was great. So, in 2018 now, I think we're, 6 years in, yeah, my dad had a change in his circumstances that allowed him to help us financially with IVF. And this was, I get emotional thinking about it, because it was just like the most generous gift that anybody can give you, is that just the hope of parenthood. So so after that, we scheduled our IVF consultation and with the doctor, the other clinic that we had been at, and started the ball rolling on IVF. And, as much as, like I said before, we liked our doctor, it totally felt like this is just a one size fits all option. We're doing ICSI, which is the intracytoplasmic sperm injection, and then a frozen embryo transfer. There was no discussion about, like, you could do a fresh transfer, but this is why we don't want to do, we don't think it would be successful. And to be honest with you, at the time, if I have the knowledge that I have now about the ethics of it, would I make a different decision? Or are you just so emotionally, tapped out that you're just like, whatever it takes, I'm going to do it. So I don't know. I would like to think that I would make some different decisions, but, being in the midst of it, like I said, you're not thinking clearly. You're not, whatever you apply to your normal life as far as like decision making is almost out the window when you get into this, this mindset. So,
well, especially 6 years in, like that is a long time to be thinking about this. And I've read several books and other stories of people's journeys through IVF and how it becomes the center of your world. Nothing else, everything else around. So 6 years of this is your center, and I think I can't imagine.
Yeah. It is. It's pretty intense. And so like I said, maybe you're not thinking totally clearly. which actually I'm really thankful that even though it was 6 years and it prolonged, the time that we were in the middle of fertility treatments, I'm so thankful that we got those breaks, because I know people who've gone back to back to back cycles, and I just don't know how you do it physically or emotionally. So, even though, like I said, it prolonged the time that we had to do fertility treatments, at least it was, we got those breaks in between. So, when we were getting ready for IVF, you go through all that testing, HSG, hysteroscopy, so many ultrasounds, blood draws, semen analyses, all of that stuff. Everything came back normal for PCOS patient going through IVF. So, in April of 2019, started injections. I don't know much about the protocol that, the dosages we were given of medications, or I was given. It seems like it maybe was high, knowing that people with PCOS have a lot of follicles already. That's part of the PCOS, is that you produce a lot of follicles. You don't necessarily release them. So then sometimes they become ovarian cysts, and, there's all that. So I was a pretty high risk for ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, or OHSS. And my first scan, after being on injections for a week, I had 40 follicles on my right side and 25 on my left side.
Wow.
Looking back now, wondering maybe we shouldn't have moved forward with allowing these follicles to mature, because it was, that risk of OHSS at that point is really high, as far as I can tell. So,
and that's a common side effect of any time you're going through IVF or egg donation. Some ladies who do that. And that has its own set of risk factors: kidney failure, stroke, ovarian torsion. This is not I feel like sometimes big for fertility, just, OHSS can happen. And then it's kind of pushed under the rug as just this little symptom or this little problem, but it can really be a really big deal.
Yes.
So I'm glad you brought that up.
Even life-threatening, now that I've done research, after the fact, which is not helpful, but, and well, that's the thing too, is looking back, do I remember any clear-cut discussions about risk? No. The risk, there was people who are on these types of medications, they have a risk down the road of ovarian cancer. They're very slim. Something along those lines is almost like downplaying the risk. So I don't know if I was ever told a percentage. I don't know if I was ever told, babies, they don't know why, born with, through IVF have a higher risk of heart defects. I don't remember, that discussion being done until after I got pregnant, to be honest with you. And then they're like, you need to see a maternal fetal medicine specialist. So, there was the talk about risks. I don't remember. I'm sure I was given a pamphlet. I'm sure I was given resources, what to look out for, but I don't think there was ever anybody who sat down with me and said, do you understand this, risk? So yeah, I, almost immediately after starting the injections, I felt horrible. I just felt super bloated, not, to the point where none of my clothes fit me. And it was really uncomfortable. And at the ultrasound right before the egg retrieval, I had 50 mature follicles, that they could count. I mean, it got to the point they were just stopped counting because there were so many. So they had to give me additional estrogen because my levels were so high at that point. And that's the thing too, is if there's any deviance from your protocol, it's more money. I mean, and that's part of the reason I think after egg retrieval, when I wasn't feeling well, I was like, I don't want to go in for an ultrasound because that's going to be another $300, $600. It's just, you don't think about that, you just think, people that you think you get this IVF package, but then there's just so many extra expenses to it that probably do inform some of your decisions about your health, about your own care. So, we went through, we did our egg retrieval, and they got 65 eggs. Everybody was, the clinic was telling me, the staff there, they haven't heard that many eggs being retrieved before. And I was proud of myself. I was like, wow, that's cool. Like, it's great that it's working, because I know there's a lot of people who struggle to get one or two, and so, but I didn't realize that there was also the other side of it is like, you could go too far. You could have too many eggs, too many embryos, too many, there's an other side of that. So I'm really thankful that I was protected during that time from OHSS. And the next day I woke up after egg retrieval, I was so bloated. I looked 7 months pregnant. It was so uncomfortable. I was having a hard time catching my breath. I was having chest pain. But for some reason that wasn't enough for me to call the doctor. I don't know why. Looking back, that I wasn't like, wow, this is something I need to get checked out. But the next day I was so miserable that I finally called the clinic, and they got me right in for an ultrasound, and found that my ovaries were enlarged. I had a pocket of fluid on my right side, but my labs came back normal. So the doctor said, your symptoms should subside, and they did. But there's also the mental side of it. I gained 15 pounds in 2 weeks. I was bloated. I couldn't be active. I was really out of sorts, and I had a lot of anxiety about it, all things that aren't conducive to getting pregnant, really, is, the anxiety and the worry. So, out of the 65 eggs, 40 of them were fertilized, which, looking back, why did we fertilize 48 of them? I have no idea why. If I could go back, honestly, at this point, I think I would fertilize what we would use. And then, that would be it, because now, like I said, we have all these embryos that we don't know what to do with.
Currently 39 then.
20. So we have 29 in storage. So we ended up with 30 matured, or 30, embryos that got to far enough along to be frozen. And one of them obviously was our son.
Right.
And then, so now we have 29. We have 29 sitting in storage that we pay $600 a month to keep there, because we don't know what to do with them. So, and I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later, but, after that, I did get, the OHSS symptoms did subside, and we were starting to prepare for the transfer. And I think 2 weeks before our transfer, I got an email from the fertility clinic that saying that you owe us $7,000 and we can't proceed until you pay that. And at this point, I had already bought all my medications with expiration dates. I had, we were, you get it in your mind that this is what we're moving forward. And we didn't have $7,000 to pay. So at this point, we had paid all of the majority of our costs up front. So I wasn't expecting a bill this large. And I called the business office, and it's something about the way that our nurse entered the package we got into the system, that they couldn't bill us at a discounted rate, and blah, blah, blah. So I had to call our nurse, and then she's like, I don't know what they're talking about. And then I had to call the business. So I was like the middleman trying to go back and forth between, and our clinic has multiple locations. So it's not like she could just pop over to the office and be like, what is this? And so, the bigger any organization gets, the more disconnect there is. And so I think that's no different from fertility treatments. The difference is that, at this point, you're so emotionally invested, that this kind of stuff it's a huge blow. So,
and you're currently treating yourself, like you're getting ready for possibly the biggest step of this whole process.
Exactly. And you're supposed to be calm, and you're supposed to all the things that, they tell you to do when you're trying to conceive is, relaxation and, lowering your stress and all of that. I mean, the process itself ramps all of that up, 10 times more than it would be if you were just trying naturally. So they, I talked to the business office, and the girl I talked to was like, I'll look into it and call you back. And I never heard back from her. So I just assumed that they had worked it all out. And then a few days later, I got another email saying, oh, well, actually you owe $3,500. And I'm still like, why? So
I still
again,
want to owe $0.
Yeah, I still paid, 30,000. So why do I need to pay more? And, so there's just this, like, I had to be the middleman here, and I had to, try to figure it out. I asked for an itemized bill. Just stuff that, why as a patient do I have to keep track of how much I've already paid and how much needs to be paid? So I went back and forth about them, and I got a call back from the clinic manager saying, it was a mix-up. It's been sorted out. And then at that point, I unloaded on her and was just like, listen, this is not the first time actually that we were overbilled for services. And if I hadn't been keeping track of all of this, we would have just paid it, because you're on the roller coaster. So you can't get off, really, without, substantial loss of, your physical. I've already started taking my medications. You're going to lose that. You're going to have to start all over. And then you're already invested emotionally. Like, you already have a date in your head that this is the day we're doing our transfer. And so this kind of stuff is, I'm sure that a lot of people were just like, okay, fine, and just paid whatever the clinic was asking them without double checking. So, when you get, again, the financial aspect of it just really makes this, it's bad enough that physically you have to do so much to get pregnant, but then, financially and emotionally, it really starts taking a toll. So, I just let her know, that I was not happy, and that this is supposed to be a time where I'm, not stressed, and that this is causing me so much stress. So we, went on to do our frozen embryo transfer on, I think, June 18th of 2019. 2 weeks later, learned that it was successful. Had a pretty smooth pregnancy. Other than, you have to do, I was a geriatric pregnancy, over 35.
I love that term.
I think they're changing the language, which is nice, but that when I was still doing it, that was geriatric. So I had to go to the maternal fetal medicine specialist for that. And then to get the heart, my son's heart checked out, just to make sure that, there were no, because of the risks of IVF. So thankfully all that came back fine. Our son was born March 13th of 2020, Friday the 13th. Everything shut down. The hospital did while I was in labor. I had to go in for a C-section. I had a uterine infection. I was induced, and it was just like this really long process. But while I was in there for my C-section, my mom and sister got kicked out of the hospital. They're like, we're shutting down. Everybody can only have one visitor, and that visitor has to stay with them, during the pandemic. Because of the pandemic. Wow. Yep. So, my mom and sister got to glance at him, and then they had to leave. So, it was, quite a crazy experience, but, looking back on it, you see, like I said, I'm so thankful for my son, and whatever it takes, I'm so glad that he's here. But I see a lot of red flags, and I do see the ways that I could do things differently that you just don't see when you're in the middle of it. And that nobody talks about. During this entire process, I was part of a church. I was really heavily involved in a church working in Sunday school, and not one person, nobody talked about, when does life begin? What are the ethical ramifications of creating more embryos than you could ever use in your lifetime? What are the ethical dilemmas of freezing human embryos? I mean, that's, there's a whole thing there. So, I grew up in the church. I was heavily involved in the church during this entire process, and just nobody was talking about any of this. And there's some things looking back that I would have done differently. Like, why did I have to be on such high doses of medications to produce 65 eggs? Why were all of my viable eggs fertilized? I didn't know I had a choice to not fertilize all of them. It just happened. And so at that point, maybe I would have only fertilized, the one or two. And then, if that didn't work, then, I mean, I know financially it's more expensive, but we wouldn't have been in this spot that we're in now. So, and
I've talked to different people, and I've even talked to someone who works at a clinic and actually had her on my podcast. And they talk about, though, how, the more you can get, the better, because there's going to be dropouts of success each step.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
So, but that's like a scare tactic. And then you're left with all of, like you said, then you're left with these decisions that you didn't want to have to make in the first place.
Yeah.
But it very much felt in talking to her that it's kind of like, okay, well, you want the most you have, because then at the next step, some are going to drop out and you don't know how much that number is going to be. And then from there, not all of them are going to make it. Some of them are going to die. Some will die in the process. We don't even know really what happens to embryos that are frozen for X amount of time. I mean, now they're scientists saying, oh, you can freeze them for 50 years. Okay. Jennifer likes to joke and that, she throws beef out if it's a year old in the freezer, like what do we do?
What are the changes, that are happening during that, freezing process? No, I agree. We probably wouldn't have even frozen any embryos. You would have tried, I would have pushed for a fresh transfer. But then, I had the OHSS. So it's kind of like this weird dichotomy, because we were recommended the frozen embryo transfer because I had such a high risk of OHSS. Well, did I need to have 65 eggs if we were going to do a fresh transfer? Probably not. So, I don't know a lot. I don't know all of the science behind it, and I'm not claiming to, but I would have done more research. I wish I would have done more research. I wish I would have looked into it before.
Have you heard of NAPRO technology? This is something fairly new to me in the last few years. We've had a couple of, actually I have a gal that I interviewed, I think season 2, Dr. Caudell, I believe was her name, Susan Caudell. She is a doctor and she practices NAPRO technology now, but she had her kids through IVF, similar story. Doesn't obviously regret having her children. They're the
of course not,
but definitely would not, and actually counsels people not to go through the process themselves. And now she teaches this very natural, something worth looking into. And I want our listeners to be aware of that. We also interview another gal that is an expert in NAPRO technology, and it talks about it's care that uses those natural kinds of things, weight loss, timing your cycles, dealing with the underlying issues, figuring out why is your husband dealing with infertility? Is it something that we can fix before we send you down this, road with no exits, So I just wondered if you had heard of that. Like I said, I've only heard of it in the last couple of years after talking with these physicians who have had these experiences and now are teaching that, or using that as a model for their care for their men and women.
Yes. And that's one thing too, before we even got on this fertility ride, I wish we would have looked at things from a more natural perspective. Like I said, supplements or, weight loss diet. What is it that is causing this? Because at the end of the day, IVF is a Band-Aid, and it's a way to circumvent the normal process of things that isn't working correctly anyway, without figuring out why or trying to fix it. So, and I understand that I have the privilege of hindsight, where I can now say I have my son, but this is what I would do differently. If I hadn't had my son, and we were still in the middle of it, would I look back and say, or would I tell somebody going, who doesn't have a child, don't do IVF, or, because I have the privilege of having it have worked. And, I recognize that, and I don't want anybody who's in the middle of the, fertility journey to think that I'm dismissing that. But I just, the hindsight's always 20/20, and you wish, you can always see clearly what you could have done differently. Right. And, my husband and I talked about, before we started IVF, what we would do if we had excess embryos. And we thought, we thought, you think, okay, embryo adoption, we decided off the bat that wasn't something that we felt comfortable with, especially now that we have 29 embryos. I mean, these are our biological children. And it's so unsettling, for me. Like, what if my son falls in love with a girl that looks just like him, and you're like, oh, like, so then you have to like have these conversations with him about, hey, you probably have other siblings out there. And it's just, weirder, stranger things have happened in the world. And I have no way of knowing that those embryos that my biological children are going to be brought up in loving homes. It's just, there's a lot. I do talk to people and they're like, well, why don't just do embryo adoption? And it's like, that's just not, seeing what an embryo turns into, right? Like seeing literally from the very beginning, that picture of my son on transfer day, that little tiny embryo to what he is now, and knowing that is, that's a life, that's a unique set of characteristics. And it's, we talk about that stuff before we even got to this point. We're like, oh, this is what we would do. We would, we would totally donate them to science to help with research, but then, but then having gone through it and seeing what that little tiny embryo can become, it's no longer that simple. That decision is no longer that easy.
Right. Because you're basically signing up that embryo for research without that embryo's consent. Right. Like,
right.
It's like, yes, it's an embryo, but like you said, this is now, you can see kind of that progression.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So
exactly.
What do you have? Can I ask that question? What do you want to do with those 29 embryos?
Yeah.
If you don't know, that's okay too.
Yeah, no, so after I heard, I actually, the first time I'd ever heard anybody talk about the ethics of IVF was when Jennifer was on Ali Stuckey's podcast. And I didn't want to listen to that episode. I was like, I'm not listening to this, because knowing I'm going to feel convicted, or, just feel I don't know, you're going to second guess some of my decisions once, knowledge is power. So, but I did listen to it, and it was painful. And I reached out to Jennifer actually right away and said, here's our story, here's where we're at. And she was so gracious. She's, called me the next day, and we just talked, and she listened. And, she offered some suggestions about, having our clinic release the embryos to us, and, some kind of ceremonious way honoring the lives that they could have been. Because, we're done growing our family. I'm older, and I don't, I don't have the patience, that I would have had, many years ago. So, we're done growing our family, so we're not going to use the embryos. So, just talking to her about, just a way to honor that. So, I haven't pulled the trigger and reached out to the clinic yet to see, if that's something that they can do. But, it's weird. My husband doesn't feel as, strongly convicted about it, but I think there's something about, being physically the one to go through the entire process. It's more of an emotional toll on you. So, I think, something along those lines. I'm just not ready yet to pull that trigger. So, and I don't know why.
A lot. And
yes,
it takes some time to process everything.
Yes.
I just want to encourage you, because it is hard to listen to things that you're like, wow, so I appreciate you listening to that podcast. And I think Ali does such a great job with that, and knowing that there are so many beautiful children that are born through this process. That's not to be negated, but to put a pause and say, this is controversial. This is personal, but we must talk about it.
Yes.
As a society, as church, we must talk about it. And so I appreciate you going out on a limb and listening and hearing things, and then coming forward and getting getting in touch with us, with Jennifer. And I just encourage anyone else who might be listening to this or who have listened to the podcast with Allie and Jennifer to reach out to us. We are here as an organization to help and to help educate. And so just encourage anyone and who might want to share their story or just need someone to listen to their story or might have questions. We're happy to help you. And I believe if you haven't watched that podcast, you can I'll include the link when we go live with this to watch Allie and Jennifer talk, because I think it's a really brilliant conversation to listen to. And really, they both do an excellent job describing it and talking through it with compassion and love and
no judgment. I didn't feel judged, talking to Jennifer. I didn't feel judged listening to the podcast. And I think when you know better, you do better. And so I just, if anybody, if this, this podcast or any other, podcast or whatever it is, a resource, if it can just help people slow down before they jump on that roller coaster and look at what their options really are. I think that's the best, we can hope for. So.
Well, thank you. Our time is coming to an end. So I'm just going to leave with one last question. If you could give advice to a woman or family going through this or getting ready, besides just knowing all their options, or if you could reach out your hand to another woman in that waiting room with you, what would you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the advice that my, friend gave me about, once you have your baby in your arms, whatever that is, if that's through adoption, if that's through, being a quote unquote surrogate mom to, the children in your life. So not a surrogate, but, being a mom to the children in your life, that second mom to, nieces and nephews or whatever it is. Once you have that child in your arms, the pain does lessen. Like, this is not going to be the rest of your life, whatever that is, and not to say that there won't be pain if it doesn't work out, if you don't end up with a success story like I had, there's still going to be pain there, but I would just say slow down, try to, first of all, get a second opinion. If you don't like the way that, a doctor's talking to you, or you don't feel comfortable with any aspect of the process, say something, ask what your options are. You don't have to do anything that you feel uncomfortable with, and listen to that gut feeling, because there were a lot of times where things didn't feel right and I didn't do anything about it. So, but also just, try to reach out to somebody who's either been through this or, a support system, somebody that is not emotionally wrapped up in it with you, that you can bounce ideas off of, that you can, that would give you an objective perspective of what's going on, because it feels all consuming and it feels like it's never going to end. But I think that there's ways to do this. My bug just flew by. There's ways to do it in a way that honors the life that you're creating. I really believe that, and I wish I would have known that at the time.
Well, thank you so much, Jennie, for your vulnerability and your authenticity. So I just want to thank you for coming on the show and taking time out of your day to talk with us and talk to our listeners over such a vulnerable subject. So thank you so much.
Thanks for the work that you guys do.
Of course. I also want to thank all of our listeners and subscribers for getting us to season 4. And we have many more podcasts ahead for you. I hope that we continue to challenge each of you to think beyond the masses.